Justice Melton. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. Glamping is basically camping with amenities. And when you grow up without electricity and running water, you appreciate amenities. And it's a wonderful idea to be around nature. I don't have to be a part of it. Enough of that. I like air conditioning. In any case, it is an honor to be here. It is an honor to be in the state of Georgia. I spent this week at the University of Georgia, and I think I compromised my voice because I met with so many students, but I hope this, at least what little I have to say, is worth your being here, and I have sufficient voice to say it. But again, I'd like to thank Chief Justice Melton. I like the sound of that, by the way. I'd like to thank Chief Justice Melton for introducing me, and I'd like to thank so many members of my colleagues on the bench, and members of the bar for being here, so many of our leaders, our local leaders who are responsible for the governance of this area and for providing this wonderful courthouse. It was an honor to meet so many of them earlier and to see how well, unlike the city that I work in, to see how well they all seem to cooperate and work together. And I thank you all for being here on this important day. And again, I thank you for affording me this wonderful honor of being a part of this amazing ceremony and to help dedicate the addition to the Newton County Judicial Center. It is a pleasure and truly an honor, as I said before, to return to the state of Georgia. If I had my druthers, I would be a resident of the state of Georgia today. But sometimes we are called to do what we must do. And it's our duty then to simply allow that will to be done, not ours. I must say though, having seen just a small part of it, this is a stunning addition to an already beautiful building. Everyone who played a role in the design and the construction of this building, this spectacular building, has to be proud of it. They have to look at it and say, this is good. Today, this building is a spectacular exhibit of art, of architecture and engineering, and we celebrate that beauty. Tomorrow, though, and thereafter, it will represent something far more important as it becomes the new home of many of the county's judicial services. As Winston Churchill observed, and I quote, "We shape our buildings, thereafter they shape us." At the laying of the cornerstone of the United States Supreme Court building, where I've served for now almost 3 decades, then President of the American Bar Association, Guy Thompson, remarked that the building would serve as, and I quote him, "a memorial of bloodless battles, yet battles upon whose issues hung our liberties, the integrity of our federal union, its harmony and balance, and our social and economic destiny." This might seem a bit overdramatic. Perhaps it does. The Supreme Court building is, after all, merely a building. And as an aside, I say, and particularly in my early years, when the going was tough, the cases difficult, sometimes the work seemingly overwhelming, I would go out at night in front of the building and look at it, and it was not just the building. It was the symbol of something that is critical to our country. It is a symbol for those of us who grew up down here. It was a symbol of hope, of stability, of fairness. In any case, the work that's done in the courthouse there, the work that we do, and in courthouses across this country is of a paramount importance to this republic and to each of us as citizens of this state, of this county, and of this country. It is in our courthouses that the Constitution, our national Constitution, our state Constitution are defended, and our laws are upheld and applied on a daily basis and in individual cases. It is in our courthouses that we distinguish between guilt and innocence, and truth and falsehood, and in doing so, where we protect our individual liberties and resolve our personal and business and group disputes. It is in our courthouses where the rule of law is most ardently enforced, and as a result, our nation serves as a haven and serves us as a haven and serves other countries and the rest of the world as a beacon of hope. Our founding fathers anticipated that courts would be critical to the success of our nation. Indeed, courts, and state courts especially, were a cornerstone of the society that they envisioned. The founders, most people forget that there was no federal system of courts. It was thought that the state courts would do most of the enforcement and adjudicate most of the cases. The founders rejected rule by whims of monarchs. They rejected the rule by oligarchs and by titled nobility, and instead made this nation a republic, one that recognized and protected an individual's unalienable rights. Our founders did much more than pay lip service to the notion of rights. They knew the only way liberty could truly be secured was through a limited national government whose powers were spread across three co-equal branches. This framework would have been unworkable without one key ingredient, the rule of law. The founders therefore adopted as their guiding principle that there is a body of fundamental law, our written Constitution, to which every exercise of power must conform. As John Adams famously wrote in the Massachusetts Constitution, the United States was to be, quote, a government of laws and not of men. To apply this body of fundamental law to cases became the special charge of the judiciary, of all of the judiciary, federal, state, and local. The capstone of that law was the right to due process, which the framers of the Fifth Amendment derived from England's Magna Carta, adopted in 1215. The Magna Carta prohibited free men from being seized, imprisoned, or stripped of rights or possessions, except by the lawful judgment of their equals or by the law of the land. Our English predecessors cherished this right to lawful process because without it, they knew that there would be arbitrary rule that would reign across their land. More than 500 years after King John signed Magna Carta, actually under duress, we adopted the Fifth Amendment, which provided that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. This amendment guarantees to every citizen that the national government will act according to the laws and the processes duly enacted by a politically accountable legislature. And through the 14th Amendment, the Constitution applies the very same guarantees to the state governments, to all of us. The importance of due process is illustrated by the famous scene in the play A Man for All Seasons, when his son-in-law suggested cutting down every law in England to get after the devil. Thomas More responded in this way, and I quote, And when the last law is down and the devil turns round on you, where would you hide? The laws being flat. If you cut them down, do you really think you can stand upright in the winds that blow them? Yes, he said, I'll give the devil benefit of law for my own safety's sake. Our founders likewise knew that the rule of law, anchored by the right to due process, would protect us all from the winds of injustice that would knock us all down in their absence. Just as important as the due process clause is the equal protection clause, which prohibits a state from denying to any person, to any citizen within its jurisdiction, the equal protection of the laws. This clause, ratified in 1868, just a few years after the Civil War, ensures that individuals will be treated equally by the state without regard to race, color, or creed. In promising equal treatment and prohibiting classifications based on race, the Equal Protection Clause contradicted racial discrimination and segregation, though it took almost 100 years for the promise to be enforced. Enforcing constitutional guarantees does not always make judges popular, nor are their decisions always afforded the respect that they deserve. This was certainly true for the judges enforcing the 14th Amendment. It required great courage and commitment for Justice Harlan, then Justice Harlan, to be the lone dissenter in Plessy versus Ferguson and to stand up for the constitutional rights of all citizens, including black citizens. Even half a century later, it required fortitude for all 9 justices of the Supreme Court, on which I now serve, to come together in Brown v. Board of Education, the year I began school, the first grade in Savannah, Georgia, or actually in Pinpoint, to hold unconstitutional a practice that existed in 21 states and begin to address the central contradiction in our republic, the contradiction of race. And in doing so, they showed that though our system and our governance is flawed, it is perfectible, and we are in the process of perfecting it. These constitutional guarantees would be hollow without courts to enforce them. Recognizing this, the founders made clear that judges were to follow the law, not their own whims. In Federalist number 78, Hamilton wrote that the courts were to be, quote, the bulwarks of a limited constitution and guard against the Constitution and the Constitution and the rights of individuals from passing mischiefs. He said that judges are not to consult popularity, but instead to rely on nothing but the Constitution and the laws. Because the founders understood that adherence to the Constitution could put judges at odds with the prevailing public opinions and the preferences of the political branches, the Constitution insulates federal judges from political reprisal by granting them lifetime tenure. Although state judges do not have the same lifetime appointment, they play the very same essential role as federal judges. As I think of the issues that may be raised and the challenges to be confronted in this building in the years to come, I encourage my fellow judges who are here to stay true to their principles and to withstand the pressures from those whose interests do not always include upholding the law. Judicial independence is critical to liberty and to justice. In our great country, the judiciary is not a puppet of those in power, nor is it the engine for pioneering social change. Rather, it is a safeguard against tyranny and an assurance of neutral arbiters for those seeking the protection of the law. In the face of negative consequences for adhering to the rule of law, I encourage you all to have the courage to stand up for the principles that undergird our laws and that should bind us as citizens. For you bear the critical responsibility in our Federalist framework to uphold the Constitution and the impartial and just application of the laws to our fellow citizens. Judges' commitment to neutrally applying the law to the facts is as important today as it ever was. It is becoming increasingly common for public opinion to galvanize behind particular outcomes and around particular interests without regard for the law or an objective assessment of the facts. Advancing a narrative all too often becomes more important than the rule of law, and it can be tempting for us as judges to want to fit into that narrative or to confuse what we perceive as a just outcome with the justice that the law requires, and that flows from being fair and impartial. As judges, we have a sacred duty to resist that temptation. Our calling and our oath is not to be popular, but to be faithful in applying the law in a fair manner and an impartial manner. This commitment to the rule of law under pressure is not limited to judges. Many in this community will be called to participate in this process as jurors, and their duty to faithfully execute the law is no less important than that of the judge. The right to a jury trial is fundamental to the search for truth and the protection to our liberty. Indeed, jury trials were so important to our founders that the failure to guarantee the right to a jury trial in federal civil suits almost prevented the ratification of the U.S. Constitution. The state of Georgia guaranteed the right to trial by jury in its first constitution in 1777, and Georgia's constitution preserves that right to this day. We hear much today about the benefits of freedom and liberty, but we don't often hear much about the corresponding responsibilities. The liberty we cherish requires a coordinate effort from all citizens. Jury service is but a small but important part of that effort, and it affords all members of the community, great and small, the enormous honor and responsibility of participating in the administration of justice for their fellow citizens. So to me, this building serves not just as a reflection of this community's commitment to liberty and justice, but also a monument to the role that each member of the community will play in securing those ideals. In thinking about the role of the community in upholding the law, I'm reminded of the famous scene from To Kill a Mockingbird, the movie and the book, where Atticus Finch stands guard outside of Tom Robinson's cell. As many of you remember, Tom was a black man who was falsely accused of rape and was being subjected to threats of mob violence. Atticus Finch calmly faces down the members of the mob, whose members, unfortunately, ultimately lose their nerve when Atticus's children show up and force them to face their own consciences and their own actions. Judges and jurors are called to stand as Atticus and his family did between the mob and the accused. Just as Atticus stood to protect his client, we must stand and fight to ensure that justice prevails over the vengeance of mob rule. Today we celebrate the expansion of the building that will provide the setting for important, if not critical, work. Its architecture will surely bring well-deserved pride to all who work here. But when it's all said and done, the true beauty of this building will be in its affirmation to all who enter that they can expect to find in this building, behind this wall, the rule of law, and through its equal and fair application, that they can find the justice to which we are all entitled, and that, in the end, is equal justice under law. Thank you all.